Talk. Learned helplessness. The realization or belief of helplessness, such that the organism afflicted gives up all attempts to combat the adverse stimuli. Discovery. Martin Seligman conducted behaviourist style experiments on dogs at the University of Pennsylvania in 1967, when he accidentally discovered the phenomenon now known as learned helplessness. Seligman wanted to see what would happen if dogs were put in a position where some of the dogs could learn to escape adverse stimuli and some of them could not. Part 1 of Seligman's experiment included 3 groups of dogs. Each group of dogs was tied up in a harness. The harness was near a lever. The lever would either stop an electric charge being passed to the dogs, or it wouldn't. As in, it wouldn't work, it was just a lever that was there. So, group 1 was a control group. The dogs were simply placed in a harness and later removed. They had no electric shocks, nothing happened, they were just in the harness. The reason for this is to test that it's not the dogs being put in the harness that was causing the later effects, which we'll discover in a minute. Group 2 had control over the electric shocks they received. They could learn to press the lever to stop the shocks. So when they have the electric shock, dogs typically try to find an escape. Now, the way this works usually is the punishment they're receiving, the electric shock, is adverse. They don't want it. So what they do is they flail about and they may accidentally have pressed the lever. Pressing the lever would stop the electric shock, thus preventing the punishment, and they have now learnt that what they needed to do to stop the electric shock is to press the lever. So the next time the electric shock happens, they press the lever quicker. The more times this happens, the quicker they'll press the lever, and the more obvious it will be that they have consciously learnt to press the lever. Group 3 did not have any control over the electric shocks they received. Group 3 was connected to Group 2. When Group 2 received a shock, so did Group 3. Thus, when a dog in Group 2 stopped the electric shock by pressing the lever, Group 3 also stopped being shocked. This is quite important. Group 3 were the only group to display symptoms like clinical depression, which is indicative of learned helplessness. Because the dogs in Group 3 didn't have any control over their experience, they didn't have any control over the electric shocks when they started or when they stopped, they were the ones who realised they can't do anything about it and thus gave up. That's essentially what learned helplessness is. So let's look at another example using a rat. Rats are famously used in experiments by psychologists all the time. This is a very similar example, also I believe conducted by Seligman later. So what happens here is the rat is in a cage with an electrified floor. Again, the response lever would either work or not work. The lights, this green and red, are there to tell the rat what's going to happen when the lever's pressed. If it's green, they press the lever, they'll get food from the food dispenser. If it's red, then it's there to stop the electric shock. So, once the rat has learned to press the response lever, they don't develop learned helplessness because they can prevent the adverse stimulus of electrocution. However, in a second cage, the response lever would never turn off the electric floor, and thus the rats would learn that they could do nothing about the situation and thus give up. This is the essence of learned helplessness. As there was nothing the rats could do, they accept the fact and give up all hope. Once an escape is provided, organisms which have learned helplessness do not attempt to escape. So even if the cage doors open, the rat won't try and stop and get out. They will just stay there. They have given up if the rat has learned helplessness. Further examples. Depression is perhaps the most common place where learned helplessness can be found. People who are diagnosed with depression can often develop such symptoms as anhedonia. Alongside their depression, they can also develop learned helplessness. They feel there is nothing they can do to cure their feelings of hopelessness, so they just give up. This is very common if you've ever met anyone who's had depression or had depression yourself. When someone tries to condole someone who's had depression or is currently having depression, they don't respond. They think everything's hopeless, there's nothing you can do. And this is learned helplessness. People who have been kidnapped often develop learned helplessness as they believe they cannot escape and thus give up. That's a very simple example. Here's another example which is quite common as well. So a student may have put in maximum effort. They've tried everything they can. They've done all the homework. They've turned up to all the classes. But then in the end, they only receive a low grade. This is when students often develop learned helplessness, especially if they have tried really hard to achieve high grades, but then they only achieve low grades. If the student has developed learned helplessness, they may claim not to be smart enough as they did everything they needed to do, but in the end failed, so that they feel that therefore they will always fail because they're not smart enough, even if they are. It may have just been a bad exam, they may not have been feeling it all the time, but they don't believe this. They believe that it's them, that they're the ones who are useless because they have learned helplessness. They don't believe they can do anything to stop achieving low grades in the future.